Good evening. Korach tonight. Last week, those of you who are here will remember that we talked about the question of what is good li, what is the land of Israel good for me, shlach lecha, send for yourself messengers. And the notion I was exploring was that the meaning of good and bad in this book, in the book of Bamidbar, Sefer Bamidbar, has to do with a certain subjective goodness and badness. In other words, do I love it or do I hate it? Is it something that I want? Do I want to go up to the land? Or actually, do I not want to go up to the land? And that's the issue that was really at stake. The people think they want, when it turns out they really don't want. And therefore, their fantasies overcome them, and they are afraid, and they go into hysterical crying, and they repeat mantras over and over again, as if they're deeply traumatized and have really no interest in the journey, in where they're going. And they're condemned to die gradually over the course of 40 years, which is a mitigated fate. They don't all die at once. Now it will be, as it were, more natural, spaced out over the 40 years. Nevertheless, what's the next thing that happens in the chronology here is that a rebel very successfully gathers around him a large part of the people. That's what we understand. That is not a small faction, but actually a large part of the people accumulate around him. He has a drawing power. And basically, he is proposing to replace Moshe. He makes a speech at the very beginning of the parsha. And the speech is a strange mixture. Right? How does the speech go? If you look at, actually on your source page this week, you can find the sources from the Torah itself. So you don't have to necessarily look up a book, a sefer. But here we are. Number one on the source page, Vayikahalu al Moshe. What is their platform, their political agenda? They ganged up against Moshe and Aaron. Vayikahalu al. There is animosity here. And they said to them, Rav lachem. Quite enough. You have taken, that's quite enough. You have gone too far, it's translated here. Meaning it's a question now of how much is enough, how much is too much, how much is too far. And we think you have gone too far. You have taken too much power on yourselves. But if you look at the next thing they say, right, let's read it together now. Ki kol haida kulam kedoshim uvetocham Hashem. And if I take that by itself, in isolation, for the whole community are entirely holy, and in their midst is God, then I have to say that always did sound, and still sounds to me, like an impeccable ideology. It's an impeccable vision of the people. That is, what could be better? Here they are, arranged around in a harmonious way, arranged around the Mishkan. The Mishkan is now in their center, the holy, the sanctuary. And God is living in the Mishkan, whatever that means. God is in residence. Somehow God is really among them, in the midst of them. And all the people are entirely holy. Kol haida kulam kedoshim. It sounds like an idyllic, lyrical description, at least of an ideal Israel. The problem is that this is a political platform. And as a political platform, one is suspicious, I want to suggest, of the word kol and kulam. Everyone is totally. There's something about that claim that should put on a red light. There's a fantasy here of some kind, and there is a fear here, which leads to extremist, totalistic language. The language of all and totally. One should always watch out for such language. It pleases us in a sense. You read it, you think, oh, that's beautiful. And then you see the rest of the sentence. Umadua titnasu al kahal Hashem. So why should you people, Moshe and Aaron, raise yourselves up above titnasu? Why should you claim thinking vertically somewhere? Right? You have taken enough power for yourselves, too much power. Why should you raise yourself up above those who are all the same as you? We are all holy. Everyone is holy, and somewhere the implication there is we are all equally holy. Well, that may not be so. We can all be holy, whatever that means, and not equally holy. And so you have here a kind of ideal, an implicit ideal, which I'll call a fantasy. It's a fantasy of being wholly holy. Excuse me for the outrageous pun. Of being wholly holy. The Malbim interprets it. He says, every one of us is holy, and the body of each one of us is holy from the sole of our foot to the top of our head. Meaning no differentiations at all. There's a certain, you could almost call it a kind of mysticism if you want to be generous. A kind of mysticism which presents itself as not making distinctions and differentiations. Everything is holy. And in certain moods, one can have that kind of vision of things. But these are not mystics. These are people proposing an argument. And the argument is step down. Why should there be a top man in that case? One of the classic criticisms of Korach, based on this pleasing agenda, which we have to be suspicious of, one of the classic criticisms is to say that we don't see, if there's so much against singularity, if there's so much against some people being more than others, then we don't see them wanting to step down either. Right? It's not as if they offer to, the first thing we'll do is disrobe ourselves, of all that privilege, of our privileges, and they are privileged in themselves. And if we don't see that, then we have to be suspicious of this egalitarianism, pleasing as it may sound to the modern ear. Now, what I want to say is that reading it from a modern perspective, there is a kind of complexity about what they're saying that leads us to half like it and half be suspicious of it, which is actually the way it often works. That there's something in what you might call totalitarian agendas. There is something that is likable about it, strangely, if you don't think of certain things. And what Moshe knows is that what they say is not what they really mean. That is, the egalitarian program masks something else. Now, that's an assumption. I think it's an assumption about language in general. That's really what I want to talk about. That language doesn't say what it means. When people speak, we don't say exactly what we mean, especially if we're talking about ideas in the humanities, let's say. We always talk, and I'm jumping the gun here, but we'll come to it, we always talk in a sense, ki'ilu. We talk about, right, it's like any other art form. You want to communicate a vision of some kind. The problem with the rebels is they mean it literally. That's what they're claiming. And Moshe knows that what they mean is actually something else, which they're not admitting themselves. How do we know that? Because when it comes to the showdown at the end of this part of the story, when Korach and his fellow conspirators go down into the earth, that horrific apocalypse, which is supposed to unveil the truth, right? Look at, when it comes there, have a look at the passage. It's on your source page again. Number 3. Jump to number 3. Moshe says to them, Bezot teid'un ki Hashem shlachani. Now you're going to know. He addresses the whole people. He says, you are confused. Now you're going to know something clearly. What is it that you're going to know that has been cast into confusion? That it was God who sent me. Now, that was not specifically what the rebels questioned, but implicitly it was. Why did you raise yourselves up above the rest of the people? In a sense, what they really mean is we don't believe in your whole fiction about God. That God spoke to you and God appointed you, and then there was everything you have done here has really been a product of your personal hunger for power. That you have actually created a backstory of some kind. And this is, of course, after Har Sinai, which is stretching it a bit. But this appointment to power, and Moshe now says, but now you're going to know that it was God who sent me to do all these things. Ki lo milibi. That's a very fraught expression, lo milibi. It wasn't my invention. Whoever said it was his invention. And the understanding is that that's what they are saying, actually. That's what the rebels mean. It's a theological rebellion as well as a political rebellion. That in some way they see it as a personal power grab on the part of Moshe, and that God's role in all this is really a matter of constructions. That you have created a world of meaning which is very difficult to question from the inside, and now we are stepping outside it, and we are saying we are unmasking you. We're trying to demystify you. Another expression that has a certain weight these days. And Moshe says to them, I know exactly what you are saying, and I want you now to know, to the people now, to know that it was indeed God who sent me. And then he proposes an upheaval of reality. He really got Moshe stacks the cards? Stacks the cards against himself. If these rebels die a normal human death, and they meet normal human fate, kol ha'adam, gudat kol ha'adam, the way that every man dies, every human being dies, lo Hashem shlachani. Every time I read this, I get a frisson, there's a little shiver, because here is Moshe willing to say, you want to step outside? All right, I'll step outside with you for a moment. And I say, let's put that possibility on the table. It wasn't God who sent me. And he's willing to actually say the words. If things go normally, and people die in the normal way, then, okay, it wasn't God who sent me. But if something extraordinary happens now, some kind of penetration of our world, something comes and undoes our normal world, for instance, a new creation, God will create a new creation, and the earth will split open its mouth and swallow them and all who belong to them, and they will go down alive into the underworld. Then you will know that these people have been attacking God. There's a theological issue here. It's a question of radical meaning. So, notice the oral imagery. It's not enough to say if there's an earthquake, which is a pretty unusual, because that would make it, in a way, one of the things that happens in the world. So it's shot through with fantasy, what Moshe is saying here. And it's a horrific fantasy. The earth not only will gap open, but it will open up its mouth and swallow. Now it's horrific. It's the stuff of nightmares, of children's nightmares, I suppose. Somewhere the forces of nature suddenly eat you up. It's the idea of being consumed. And the earth will acquire a mouth, and then what happens immediately after this? When this extraordinary thing happens, you will know that my story is true and their story is not. We're trying to now find a way of effectively advertising the truth. I think that's perhaps the most important clause in this account. It was just as he finished speaking these words. He had just finished speaking, barely finished speaking, when the earth, what did the earth do? Tibaka ha'adama. The earth that was underneath them, that is, the solid earth, that they think is unchanging, solid, maintaining earth, opens up, tibaka, splits open underneath them. Now that's a description of an earthquake. Suddenly, but that's not enough. And notice how the descriptions continue in the realm of fantasy. And the earth opened up its mouth and swallowed them. We're not spared that image in reality. It's not enough to say it once when Moshe says it. This is exactly what happened. That is, somewhere the world goes crazy. That's what's called apocalypse, where everything is upside down. What should be up is down, and what should be down is up. And by this, all the veils of natural reality are swept aside, and you know the stark truth. And the stark truth is never a good truth, right? The truth of apocalypse is never happy. It's a way of saying there is catastrophe. There is catastrophe. There is an unrecognizable reality, and then you know that the only way to go now is to God. Somewhere that God is behind. Now you know the power of God in very catastrophic situations. And what happens then is that the rebels and everyone with them is swallowed. They're swallowed, and they go down alive into the underworld, and then the earth covers them over again, and they vanish from the midst of the community. Now, every phrase there is very effective. Right? This is an act of dibur. It's the Torah is communicating something to us. And I want to say it's not communicating just for the thrills of horror. You know, the sense of, really, it's laid on thick here, you know, the horror of what's being said here. What I want to suggest is something like this. And it's there in that sentence. No sooner had Moshe finished speaking when the earth opened its mouth. Moshe closes his mouth, which had been engaged in doing one of the things that mouths do, which is to talk. That's one of the oral functions, is to speak. When speaking comes to an end, immediately something catastrophic takes over. There is another use of a different mouth, and this time it means a swallowing. It's the eating use of the mouth, consuming, and the people are consumed. That is some kind of naked power takes over, which is God showing something. And I'd almost put it like this. Moshe speaks as long as he can. It's a kind of holding action. Just before the catastrophe, Moshe not only warns them of it, but tries at the very last moment, he tries dibur. He tries to use language in some way by forecasting what's going to happen. Perhaps the rebels will in some way be affected by words, and words are much less dangerous than what happens when the earth opens up its mouth. And so clearly, Moshe has a preference for language over the oral use of the earth. But there is one thing that language does less well than catastrophe of this kind, apocalypse, and that is demonstrating the truth. Language leaves us usually in some kind of gray area. We never, or very rarely, sweep, what's the expression I want? We never really usually are able to manifest absolute evidence for the truth in words. Words are, in a way, always effective up to a point. If we're lucky, we can manage to say something in words, but words are always struggling against their own incompleteness. What happens when the earth opens up its mouth, that's very effective. That does exactly what it's supposed to do. And so if it's a matter of knowing the truth, then if language doesn't work, then there is always that. Now, this is a kind of ominous, it's a sinister way of looking at orality. What is language? And what I want to focus on this evening is the rebellion of Korach and Moshe's attempts to speak to the rebels as a failed conversation, with a whole history behind it. That what Moshe is doing when he first addresses the rebels, after they've come out with their manifesto, about how, what do they say? All the community are totally holy. I would call that, although it has its seductive side, that platform, I would call that anti-language. I would call that a kind of defeat of language. Because when you say that something is totally holy, you're actually closing the door to any kind of rational argument. Totally holy is like, and it's a brilliant, it's a stroke of genius on the part of the sages, the rabbis, in the Midrash, to give us a visual image to go with their claim. And the visual image is that Korach comes with all his rebels, with all his conspirators, all dressed in talitot that are made of entirely blue-purple, the blue-purple color, which is supposed to be the one thread of the tzitzit. Yes? And here they quickly manufacture a theatrical event. It's an event which is drenched with blue. It's drenched with holiness. And they come and they challenge Moshe, and they say, you see, totality here. All holiness. Do these talitot still need a thread of blue? And they ask a halachic question, as it were, but it's a mocking question. It's a way of mocking and really cutting off any possible answer by Moshe. What is Moshe going to say? If he's telling the truth, he'd have to say yes. Even if it's all made of blue, it still needs a thread of blue because that's the law. That's how it goes. What they want to say, obviously, is why does one person get to be special? Yeah? When we're all, that's the program. But it's a program that militates against speaking, against communication. We say one image is more powerful than 1,000 words, right? That's the positive way of putting it. There's enormous impact to that blueness. They've made a point. It's very effective. But it's only effective in stultifying communication. What is Moshe going to do? And in fact, what we see him doing in the next verse is Vayipol al panav. He falls on his face on the ground. He's extremely desperate. He's really deeply affected. Let's see, where is it? Yes, number 1 again. Vayishma Moshe vayipol al panav. Moshe heard what they said, but didn't answer for a moment. For a moment, he's defeated. His face is in the ground. Means he's, we're talking about the ground and people. Yeah? In the ground means silence. The ground means the silence that leads to death. Dumiyah, going down to that ultimate side. For a moment, the void overcomes him. What am I going to say to these people? Because when they all dress up in blue in this way, notice that the word kol is manifest and hidden in that description. Talitot shekulan, there it is, all. Tchelet, and tchelet has the word kol in it. The heart of the word tchelet is the word kol. So somewhere hidden and manifest, there is that kind of totality with which they mock Moshe. And Moshe can't open his mouth for a moment. And then he gets to his feet, and he addresses Korach first, and then addresses Datan and Aviram. He makes 2 separate speeches, quite long speeches, the first one particularly. You can see it in number 2. I'm not going to read it here. I will probably look at the later speech he makes to Datan and Aviram. What I want to look at now with you is the Midrash that you can see. We're looking now at the commentary texts, page 3. The Midrash you can see in number 1, Bamidbar Rabbah. Now this was an eye-opening Midrash for me when I first came across it. Because what it points out is that Moshe spoke many words to Korach, and Korach didn't answer him. Now, who ever noticed that before? You just assume maybe Moshe didn't mean to have a conversation. He just meant to rebuke them, let's say. But no, says the Midrash, maybe his intention wasn't to have a diatribe against them. He was talking to them. He was trying to use the power of language. Lefayesotam, says the Midrash. All right, that's an interpretation. Maybe you didn't think that it wasn't so obvious to you when you read his speech that that's what it was, but the Midrash thinks you can read it that way. That what he was really trying to do is to appease them in some way and to make it possible for them to answer him. Not to scare them and not to intimidate them, but actually to open up some ground of discussion. And you don't find that Korach answered at all, says the Midrash. Now, here begins what I call the failed conversation. And this is a Moshe who expects to fail. What do I mean by that? This is the Moshe who from the beginning of the story at the burning bush told God, don't send me to speak. Don't send me to speak to Pharaoh. Don't send me to speak to Bnei Israel. Ki lo ish devarim anochi. I'm not a man of words. And when he says that, it doesn't necessarily mean, I'm always trying to make this case, just in case there are people who think differently. I'm trying to say what I think clearly. I don't think that means I've got a stammer. The stammer is a symptom. And it's a symptom of not being able to speak. I can't come through. My inner world can't come through this narrow channel here and come out successfully and effectively to the others. I can't do this thing that's called dibur. Kvad peh, kvad lashon. These are the most personal things Moshe ever says about himself. If I'm trying to understand something about Moshe, that's where I have to go. That's the basis. He's never as personal as when he's talking about what it's like to live in his mouth. Yeah, that's very intimate. What is it like to be inside me as a talking person? Which is what a human being is supposed to be. You know, it's almost a definition of the human, according to Yehuda Levi, yes? That there are living beings who can't speak, that's animals, and then human beings are constituted by their ability to speak. And here is a Moshe who knows that he can't. That this is something that's very difficult for him. And he uses the rather grotesque expression when he's arguing with God in those early days. Ani aral sfatayim. I have uncircumcised lips. Now that again, I would say, is a phantasmatic way, right? It's a way of describing what it's like to be me by saying I have a foreskin somewhere closing my lips, webbing my lips together so I can't separate them. I can't create the space necessary to resonate outwards to the world, to produce a voice, to project a voice. And he doesn't mean it only physically, right? This is the mouth as the organ of connection. The organ of connection. In Kabbalistic thinking, in Hasidic thinking, it's quite common to couple, to make a pair of the mouth and the sexual organs, because they're both organs of connection with the world, fruitful, hopefully, connection with the world. If your mouth is blocked, excuse me, show and tell, if your mouth is blocked, right, then you are not managing to connect. Or, as the Sfat Emet puts it in number 2, if you're not managing to connect, oh, does your mouth feel blocked? If you're not managing to connect, you feel extremely blocked. That is, in other words, the block is not necessarily a physical one, right? It's a feeling, it's a very intimate feeling about what I'm capable of. That movement that's called dibur. Now, that blockage, aral sfatayim, Moshe argued with God about it at the burning bush. God said they will listen to you, and Moshe said no, they won't. Really like that. It's a confrontation. Moshe says, "L'hen lo ya'aminu li v'lo yishma'u b'koli." I can't make them listen to me. And that, I suggest, is what Moshe means by I can't speak. To speak is not to say words. To speak is to reach the other, to make them listen so they will open their ears to you. How do you know if they're opening their ears or not? If you can make them speak back. If you can move them so that they want to say something in reply. It doesn't have to be agreement, on the contrary. But if you move them, right, it's a movement of some kind. You move them to some kind of question mark about the absoluteness of their own position, so that they're prepared to have a discussion with you, then that already, that's all Moshe wants. He speaks to Korach, and Korach doesn't answer. Why doesn't he answer? And the Midrash gives, in this sort of vein, the Midrash gives an analysis of Korach. He's a very clever person, Piker, in his wickedness. He knows what he's doing. And he says, if I respond, I know Moshe, that he is a very wise person, Chacham Gadol, and he will overwhelm me with his words. Yikapcheni b'dvarav, and I'll find myself agreeing with him against my will. That's a very subtle description of what it's like to be affected by dibur. And why you would actually want to defend yourself against it. Why should I take the risk of entering into, it's really quite sensible. He's very sensible, Korach, to a fault. Yeah? He says, I know I'm right. Why should I risk his eroding my rightness? He's very good with words. Isn't that really almost funny what the Chachamim are saying there? That Korach thinks that Moshe has a power with words, and Moshe thinks he's useless with words. Now there are various ways of taking this up, but just to notice it. And then you have the strange situation that Korach doesn't want, of becoming in some way split from himself. That I'll find myself agreeing with him, where another part of me knows that I don't really agree with him. And we all know what that's like. That's the risk of conversation. That's the risk of really talking to somebody. You express your truth, and the other person expresses their truth, and it might just get to you. And if it gets to you at all, then you'll find yourself split, because I still hold on to what I really think. That's what Korach, that's his position. Better, shelo izakek lo. Izakek is it's a quite a common word in Midrashic Hebrew, but it's quite subtle in its meaning. It means I don't want to get into a relationship with him. I don't want to be coupled. I looked up Jastrow to see what zakuk means. To be needy, in some way to open yourself to the other person. Right? To be niskak or niskak to someone means that you are a couple with them. You have a relationship, and that changes who each of you is separately. For as long as the conversation goes on, you are each somewhere in some kind of third space. There's a space between you, hopefully, in which there's a mixture of the two of you. And things are happening across that space. There is energy moving across the space between the two of you. I don't need any of that, says Korach. That could only undermine the absoluteness of my position, of my platform. And so he doesn't bother answering altogether. That's the extreme form of not answering. And the Midrash continues that then Moshe talks to Datan and Aviram, and they also don't answer him. Now that's an interesting point. The fact is they do answer him, but they answer him so sarcastically that it's not called dibur. Sarcasm is, what do they say, it's the lowest form of wit. Maybe it's the lowest form of dibur also. It almost cancels out dibur, because how can you have a dialogue with someone who is actually mocking him and wiping the floor with you through a kind of mockery? What is their argument? They say to him, we are not coming up, lo na'aleh, meaning we don't accept your royal invitation to come and talk to you. We don't accept, suggests Orach Chaim, this is very creative, fertile reading in number 5. I'm not going to look at it in detail. They begin their speech and they end their speech by saying lo na'aleh. You can see the speech at the end of, among the Torah sources, you can see it at the end of number 2. They say, is it a little thing that you have taken us out of a land of milk and honey to kill us here in the wilderness, but you're also lording it over us? There's another word for raising yourself up, sar, tistarer. You have not brought us to a land flowing with milk and honey, as you promised us, and you have not given us an inheritance of fields and vineyards. Are you trying to pluck out the eyes of these people? What they're accusing Moshe of here is a sarcastic version of what the original platform was, and that is that you are mystifying a situation, you are clouding the real situation with your language. You're using rhetoric. You keep on that you're bringing us up to a land flowing with milk and honey, which was what God said from the burning bush. Look at the reality. You have taken us out of a land flowing with milk and honey. Look at this form of sarcasm. It's based on a certain kind of truth. Empirically, Egypt is a more fertile land than Eretz Yisrael, we'd have to say. There is a river. There's an incredible resource there in Egypt. And so that is the fertile land. If you want to be realistic about it, they say, that's the fertile land. And you've brought us out here to this dry desert where we're all going to die. We know that from last week's Parsha. Yes. We know the fate that is ahead of us, that none of us is going to get to that mythical land that you're talking about here, no adult anyway. And this is the truth, and you are using language. And here I want to refer you to the Sforno in number 4. This is it's a reading that I've always found very powerful, in which he says, you are using language ki'ilu, as if. Language as if, that is, the language of, you promised us a world of, a land of fields and vineyards, and you even have already given us laws. That's just before this parsha. the end of last week's parsha, there are laws, agricultural laws, that Moshe gives the people, who are never going to see Eretz Yisrael, about what they should do when they come into Eretz Yisrael. Yeah. You come into Eretz Yisrael, there are certain sacrifices you will make from the fields and vineyards that you will be blessed with there. And so the rebels say here, you are using language as delusion. You are decoying us with language, lulling us with language, to make us hope that maybe in some sense we are going to enter Eretz Yisrael after all. We're onto you. You're plucking out our eyes. It's a very violent expression for someone who is making what you call a realistic argument, which really is an argument that precludes any kind of discussion. Because what they're saying basically is, we can't tolerate language in general. You are trying to use language to us, and we are against language. Because what is language? Language is, I want to say, by its nature, it is erotic and it is metaphorical. It's not a photograph of reality. Language doesn't come and tell you 2 and 2 is 4, right? There is a mathematical language that will come and tell you that, right? But even that, what in reality really, right? What counts as 2 and what counts, there are questions about how fitting that language is to reality. But certainly when you come to the language of what you might call the humanities, the language of meaning, the language of feeling, when we use language, when Moshe says, I'm taking you to a land flowing with milk and honey, he is thinking, for instance, of what God promised him. And the expression, a land flowing with milk and honey, will be used 20 times in the course of Tanakh. Right? It's used actually quite a number of times. And it always refers to Eretz Yisrael. And here now they come and say, no, actually, the truth is it refers to Egypt. If you want to be realistic about it, it's Egypt that's the fruitful land. Now, what they're doing here is trying to shear language of all its power. Its power is metaphorically. It's evocative. It's a way of creating a vision of the world. Moshe is creating a certain vision here when he talks to them about a land flowing with milk and honey. He's trying to evoke something in their mind. He's not describing the way it is, at this moment, that here in the desert. When he says when you'll be coming into the land, is he lying to them? Sometimes children are very literal-minded, and they'll accuse their parents of lying. When the parents are in fact talking ki'ilu, that is, they're talking a language of imagination. When I say you will be coming into the land, I mean the larger you. I mean your children. I'm not trying to tell you that you're... Now, that could be in a certain mood, if the people were addressed like that, you could interpret that as encouraging to the people. All right, I personally will not get to the land, but we as a people will get to the land, and our children will. And so there is grounds here for a certain courage vis-a-vis the future, a certain sense of hope for the future. But for the rebels, as we saw last week, from the last week's rebels, there is a kind of destructive skepticism that wants to shear language down, wants to cut away from language. Everything that makes it language. And what makes language language, I want to say, is eros. It's that reaching out to make a connection with the other person. It's not the realistic description of the way things are. So language has to do with communication. And here, when they say you're talking ki'ilu, by teaching us these laws, these agricultural laws, you're creating an illusion. I want to say that what they're doing is actually describing language and why one might have some questions about using language in general, the rhetorical use of language, and why in the end it's the only way to go. And Moshe starts with a certain doubt about language, about a doubt about himself in language. Can he possibly communicate in any true way that is effective, that gets other people to understand what he has to say? And he moves from that doubt somewhere past a certain fear to a point where, what do we read? He hears what the rebels have to say, and his reaction then is, all right, this is when he hears what the Datan and Aviram have to say when they're not answering him. The Midrash says this is not called an answer, and what he does after that is, what do we read there? Vayichar leMoshe ma'od. He was extremely angry, and he turns to God and starts praying and so on. But he's extremely angry. Have a look. Go back now to the Midrash that we were looking at, number 4. Sorry, not number 4. Number 1. Number 1. Number 1 among the commentaries. Yes. When Datan and Aviram say, "We are not going up," they were being very literal here. We're not coming up to talk to you. And the Midrash then makes a pure Freudian comment. The mouths of the wicked make them stumble. Pihem litzot tzadikim hichshtilam. That is, the wicked, that is, Datan and Aviram, say, "Lo na'aleh," we are not going up. Little do they know, right? Their mouths betray them. This is what Freud, the Freudian slip. Your mouth seems to know more than you know yourself. When they say, "We're not going up," little do they know that they're going down. They're going down into the underworld. Now, I suppose you could take that as a kind of ghoulish joke of some kind, but I don't think that's what the Midrash means. I think what the Midrash means here is, little do they know that they are describing their own existential state, that they're on the way down. It's not the future, we're not talking about the future, but a refusal to speak, a refusal to enter into the risks and exposures of conversation, what you might call debate or argument. A refusal to do that, to refuse words, is actually to be on your way downwards to death, which is a place of silence. Yeah, Laredet, to go down to the underworld, which is which is the place where there is no praising God, and there is no talking, and there's no, right? All that is for this world. And if you refuse this world because you're afraid of the risks, then actually you are regressing, or you are moving downwards into some kind of solipsism in which there is no possibility of movement. Now, that statement in the Midrash leaves the wicked, as they're called here, as very vulnerable at the mouth. They so much want to avoid a situation in which their mouths fail them that they get into a discussion in which they're defeated in some way. They're infiltrated by the other rather than able to make an impact themselves, that actually they find themselves moving back from the world altogether, moving away from the world altogether. And then we read Vayichar leMoshe ma'od, right at the end of the passage in number 1. And Moshe was, and the Midrash translates Vayichar as, not as he was angry, but he was upset. Why is he upset? Very briefly there at the end, the Midrash explains that, wouldn't you be upset? This is the way it goes. If you have a discussion with your friend, and you debate with your friend, you argue with your friend, and the friend answers you, then yeshlo nachat ruach. I like that expression very much. Then there's a strange kind of comfort that you feel. Nachat ruach is a kind of, yes, that's the way it's supposed to be. Even though, in fact, the argument may not be easy. Wouldn't it be better if you could just say your piece and walk off in high dudgeon? Just make your point. And that would leave you in tsa'ar, he says. If you try to talk to your friend and he doesn't answer, yesh lo tsa'ar. It becomes a monologue and you're not actually getting a response of any kind, then that is pain. Tsa'ar, I don't quite know how to translate tsa'ar. It's more like discomfort. It's like agitation. It's a feeling of being left hanging in the air. I was engaged in something and I don't have a partner. I don't have anyone to talk back to me. Never mind what he would have said. But something that allows for what I'm calling the space between. Some kind of space in which we are intertwined with each other. We are affected by each other. And here is Moshe now, Vayichar, and this is actually, it's an interesting point about that word. that if it comes together with af, vayichar af Moshe, then it does indeed mean anger. But if it comes by itself, the Targum will tend to translate it, and that's the oldest interpretation of the Torah. The Targum will tend to translate it, he was mitzta'er. He was in some kind of turmoil. He was upset, rather than specifically angry. And what you have then here is a situation in which the turmoil is created in Moshe by the refusal of the other to enter into a troubling conversation, a conversation in which things would be on the table, but there would be a strange kind of repose about it, a strange kind of feeling of that's the way it should be. That's the difficulty I want. You know, that the difficulty of talk. That's what I want. And if I don't get it, then it's a kind of deep, almost traumatic response. I'm left. Now, if one has ever had an experience of a failed conversation, yes, of an unsuccessful conversation, and the unlikely possibility that you've ever had such an experience, then you'll know how painful it can be. Yes? If there is a kind of blank facing you instead of life, right, you are starting something that has to do with life. You're going up when you start a conversation. You're not going down, you're going up. You're emerging, you're exposing yourself in some way. And the other person remains veiled, remains covered over, and doesn't allow that to happen. Now, that's the situation according to the Midrash. And I'm suggesting that this is an old story with Moshe. That Moshe has had expectations of being disappointed in this area from the beginning. Hein lo yishma'u b'koli. They're not going to listen to me. And indeed, at first, the people don't listen to him. V'lo sham'u b'nei Israel el Moshe. And here we come to a really great moment of the story, a very important moment of the story. And here it happens again, that he tries to talk to them. And in the Midrashic reading, what he gets is that kind of one-sided, right? It turns out to be a solo. I have to point out that when I do a solo here for an hour and a half, you know, I always feel a little self-conscious about it. And the only thing I can say in my defense is that I feel that it is a conversation nevertheless. Yeah. Yes. That even if people don't answer me verbally, I can sense, and otherwise I couldn't continue, I can sense that there is you are speaking back to me. Right, your eyes are speaking back, you're thinking, you're questioning, you know, your eyes are roaming in your heads sometimes, right? There is a feeling that there is something, there's movement going on here, and that's really what I'm talking about. It doesn't have to be a literal answer, right? But there has to be response. Now, that Moshe comes around to feeling that has to be the purpose of his life. In the end, the last book of the Torah, which comes right after this one, will begin with the words, Ela hadvarim asher diber Moshe. These are the words that Moshe spoke to the children of Israel. And on this midrashic level, it isn't just a headline for what's going to come, which is many words that Moshe speaks to the children of Israel, his last speeches, but it's a way of talking about something opening up between Moshe and the people in those last months, that there is dibur, that there is some kind of implicit conversation that's going on between Moshe and the people. And that he has understood at a certain point that that's what will have to happen if his life is to be of use. That it's one thing talking to God, that comes very easy to him. There seems to be kind of natural dialogue that goes on at the top of the mountain. But when it comes to other people, that's the difficult part. And that's the part that he will have to, he recognizes it, I want to say, as his chisaron. And I'm introducing here a word that the Hasidic teachers, Hasidic masters love, some of them particularly. And that is, chisaron is an incompleteness in oneself. Why else would one reach out for conversation with someone who thinks differently from one? If one didn't feel that in oneself one is not complete. If I really think I'm perfectly impeccable, my position is the only possible position, I am totally right, then why would I in any way risk losing that sense of rightness by reaching out to someone else? However, if one has a sense, what can I say, of a crack in the cup, that I am a vessel that holds, a vessel that holds blessing, shalom, shlemut, vessel that holds blessing, but there's a crack somewhere. Is that an abnormal situation? You might think, oh, terrible. I want to be complete, want to be whole. And for these Hasidic teachers, the Sfatimet, the Meir Shiloach, others, the chisaron is what constitutes the human. How do you know you're a human being? If you can get to your chisaron. If you can get somewhere within reaching grasp of the ways in which you are not complete. And then you have something to work around, a reality about yourself. And that's what necessitates dibur. Somewhere I speak out of incompleteness, and in a way I'm asking a question when I speak. Right? I'm saying something, but I'm not saying it as the last word on the subject. I'm saying it, so what do you say? Implicitly there is a feeling of, perhaps you can help me to deal with my incompleteness. Now, it doesn't have to be a very blatant thing. It can be something only I know about. In the case of Moshe, I think it's his feeling that he's not a man of words. It's pretty radical. I'm not a man of words, but gradually there grows the feeling of, that is the way in which I'm less than I should be. That's the way that, that's what constitutes me. And therefore, I need to open myself, and the risks that are involved, to speaking to and hearing from other people. Now, with this I want to come to, all right, let's have a look at quickly at number 3. When Moshe, before he makes the speech, you remember he was on the ground. His face was on the ground. And so the Talmud in Sanhedrin, which Rashi quotes here, makes this powerful statement. From here we learn that you shouldn't hold tight to a machloket. Number 3, among the commentaries. It's a little confusing between the different groups of, do you have it? Yeah. From here we learn that you shouldn't grasp tight onto a machloket. How does it put it in your English there? From here we learn, it's page 4, yes, number 3. One should not persist in strife. All right, persist in strife. A machloket is a verbal debate. It's a verbal dispute. You shouldn't grasp manically onto your position in a dispute, because that's what tends to happen naturally. That the more you talk, right, the more dogged you get, the more extreme you get. And what one should be doing actually is laying off in some sense. Beginning to let go a little bit, not getting tighter and tighter when you're in a dispute. And how is it put here? From this we learn from Moshe, because he was desperate for a certain moment, his mouth was in the ground. But then what do we read? That he was mechazer acharehem lahashlimam b'divrei shalom. That he courted them. Mechazer acharehem means he ran circles around them. As when one courts a woman, when a man courts a woman, lechazer. It means in some way to get down from one's dignity and from one's totality and to say, I'm not just a free, independent person. I need you. In some way to run circles around your lady, in order to convince her, to get through to her. And that means in some way giving up some of one's masterfulness. That's not, lechazer is not to be masterful. And so Moshe gets up from his sealed situation with his face in the ground, which is in a way a safe situation. And he exposes his face to Korach, and he speaks to Korach, and he fails. Right? He fails to achieve what he was hoping to achieve. And so you have a sense of Moshe, almost like a Don Quixote kind of character now, that he knows the right way to go, and it's a way that's exactly the opposite of the people he's trying to talk to. How do you maintain a situation like that? What do you do next? And so here I want to go to the views of 2 or 3 thinkers, classic thinkers. The first one is the Maharal, on the question of machloket. What is machloket? if it isn't something that you should hold on tight to. Number 6 on your page. This is the Gur Aryeh, who is the Maharal, 16th century philosopher, mystic, commentary on the Torah. And he is commenting on this machloket between Korach and Moshe. So he starts by making a general statement that people who are machloket specialities, machloket I'd almost translate as a schism. It's an argument that threatens to create absolute division among parties in the people, groups in the people. The danger of a machloket is that it can start off fairly trivially and fairly acceptably, but as you engage in it, you hold on tighter and tighter. It can become more and more manic in some way, till in the end it can come to what he calls churban. And he has his basis in language for saying this. He says, people who are professional schismatics, where they belong is Gehinnom. Right? So when they go down into the underworld, that's where they belong. And there's a certain iconic view here. It's almost a mythological view, because after all, on the second day of creation, schisms were created. God began to divide everything from everything by way of clarifying things. But along with that creation was also Gehinnom. Right? Take it too far, let it go crazy, and what you have is destructiveness. And here he says you have something very interesting. I'll make my own translation. You can follow in the English. And what he says is this, that there are people who know how to go beyond the strict line of rightness, of din. I know exactly what the right answer is. I know what the truth is of this matter. And there are people who are not rigid about it and can somehow ease themselves to go beyond that strict line of what the law is. That is, in a sense, I know what the right position is, and it's mine. Yeah. You notice that in Hebrew, it's not to go beyond. It's actually lifnim, mishirat adin. That is, I can hold back before getting to that line of absolute rightness. And so you'll find, for instance, I think it's in the Talmud, not the Zohar, a statement like this: the world only goes on existing. Ha'olam eino mitkayem ela b'shvil mi shebolem atzmo b'sha'at meriva. It's only because, for the sake of people who know how to put on the brakes, bolem atzmo, in the heat of dispute. That's how the world keeps on existing. That is, it's a kind of there's a destructive direction to a passionate dispute. It's not destructive in itself, but there's a direction. If you go as far as it seems to demand to go, you know the way one feels when one's having a really full-scale argument, that there's much more I want to say, and if you let yourself say the much more that you want to say, that is, right, the world can't exist. Because it's not just you and your friend we're talking about here. We're talking about something in the nature of what it is to be a human being in the world. There is this tendency in us to go too far and to individualize ourselves and separate ourselves out, which can be a good thing, to the point where actually all basis for continued existence is destroyed. And so what the Maharal says here is that people who have this ability to block themselves, right, to put on the brakes, these are not machloket people. Who are the machloket people? And he quotes from the Talmud. They are people who set all their words, their language, on din. And on din, the usual meaning is on the law. And this is a statement that's made in the Talmud to explain why Jerusalem was destroyed. A theological statement. Why was the churban of the Beit HaMikdash, the destruction of the temple and the exile of the people, why was that? Because the chachamim of Yerushalayim, the wise people, the sages of Yerushalayim, set all their words on rightness. Somewhere it's a certain tone, it's a certain tenor, which says, it's not necessarily, you might say it's arrogant if you want to put a moral cast on it, but I don't even want to say that. I want to say something a little different. You could be, in other terms, a very humble person. And yet, if you have this fantasy of rightness, of there being one right way to look at things, then that brings destruction. And that's what the Chachamim did then. They were fixated by din. That brings destruction. What brings creation, on the other hand? Right, famous Midrash. God originally wanted to create the world through din, on a principle of din, midat hadin. That is, that the world should, God is looking for, what is God looking for when he creates the world? You might say the whole project, as we understand it in mystical sources, later sources, the whole project is a strange project. God had to withdraw some of his total presence in order to make room for a world. Tzimtzem et oro, tzimtzum. That he had to in some way reduce himself, make himself less, in order to allow an empty space where there can be a world. And we'll see in a minute Rabbi Nachman evoking this. What you need is an empty space for there to be a world. And God is here creating a world. Why? In order to make trouble for himself. Here he was the only thing, right? He was the only presence. No one arguing with him, no one creating trouble. That's din in its best. There's only one truth. And what he does is withdraw the absoluteness of that truth. He makes space. It's a very physical description. Right? He moves it to the sides so as to make a space there in the middle, and where there can be a world of relative things, of differences and distances, and this day of the week and that day of the week, and different dates and different time systems. And, right? It's a hullabaloo. So much talking going on now, where there was a beautiful silent universe before. There was just God silently being. And now suddenly God has created a family. Why do people do this kind of thing? It's not only God who does it, right? Here's a couple living in marital bliss, and then they insist on having children. And if they can't have them the usual way, then they'll adopt them. They'll go to any length. Yes, I believe, I know whereof I speak. That they'll go to any length to make trouble for themselves. Yeah. To have many voices speaking irrationally, and protesting and being enraged around them from morning to night. Now, you have to think about it sometimes. What is it? And this is what God does. Why does he do it? And Rabbi Nachman will say, he does it because of his Rahmanut. What a strange idea, that he wants to exercise compassion. There's a potential capacity that he has that he can't exercise. He can't bring it into being until he has an other that he will then experience Rahmanut with. I want to try to understand that a little later, to come back to it. But the idea in the Midrash that I started on just now was, coming back to closer to the surface, is that God originally planned to create the world on the basis of din, and then he saw that the world couldn't be mitkayem. That word again. It couldn't go on being if there was din only. The Maharal puts it in his language. He's talking about relationships, and he says anyone who places all his words, all his language, all his construction of the world on the basis of absolute rightness, this person brings Khorban on the world. That world can't continue being. And you can see it there with the destruction of the Second Temple. That's the diagnosis that's given in the Talmud. That these were not stupid people, and they weren't ill-meaning people. They were people who were totally convinced of their perspective. To a killing point, to a point where aggression... Now, let me see if this... I'm going to look at the end of that, of Maharal. So what does he say there at the end? Yes, he says they did. For such people, kulo din. There you have that totality again. Kulo din. Everything is din. Right? Even issues that are not really matters of din, they will turn into matters of din, into matters of, and you can actually hear people talking this way. Some people seem to have a gleeful way of trying to understand what is the most severe possible way of interpreting a situation. because it gives you somehow a feeling of security. Then I don't have to expose myself in any way. If I can take shelter under the most firm, the most firm and rigid interpretation of things, then in some way it seems to offer some kind of fantasy relief. Be that as it may. So for the Maharal here, machloket can be destructive. But now let's look at Rabbi Nachman, number 7. And he says there is another kind of machloket. And here again he's drawing on a classic rabbinic statement, which you may remember from Pirkei Avot, that there is machloket l'shem shamayim and there is machloket lo l'shem shamayim. And it's not a simple idea. I'm not sure I understand it at all. But there is a dispute that is for the sake of heaven, translating it literally. And there's a dispute that is not motivated rightly. It's not motivated for the sake of heaven. That is, there's a kind of dispute which is creative, and there's a kind that's destructive. And that's what Rabbi Nachman wants to say. That dispute actually is essential when you're talking about creating a world. Interesting. He wants to give us the good news about machloket. There is a kind of machloket that constructs the world. If you didn't have machloket, and here I'll paraphrase rather than reading, you can read it yourselves, English or Hebrew, and I'll put it like this. One of the things he says, if all Talmidei Chachamim, if all scholars, substantial people, were echad, if they all had the same opinion, the same view, there would be no room for a world. The same kind of idea. If wall to wall, everyone was saying the same thing, that's the end of creativity. And he psychologizes that Kabbalistic description of how the world was created. And he sees it now in terms of real teachers and real students and people who have different intellectual opinions. And so on. What is the good news about difference? About different opinions? It's that ideally, at any rate, one isn't trying to squash the other entirely. A space is left between them. And in that space, a world can grow. And what he literally thinks about this is, makes it very specific. He quotes another of the Chachamim who said, Kol yamai gadalti ben ha-Chachamim. All my days I grew, I developed among the wise. That's the usual understanding, that the culture in which I grew and developed was the culture of wise people, of Chachamim b'Torah. But Rabbi Nachman reads it slightly differently. It's all my days I developed myself, I developed my ideas in the space between two Chachamim. In the space of a machloket, two people who thought differently from each other and left a certain potential space in the middle, an emptiness, a womb in which something new can grow. And there I felt my opportunity. I felt that there is a space in which I can think, and I can develop a different view of time and space and all kinds of things that maybe haven't got to do with the pure God, but God left space for that kind of development too. Now, that very beautiful interpretation of Rabbi Nachman means, now looking at it overall, it means that in a sense there is something creative, and in another sense there's something destructive about machloket. And creation and destruction, again, you could say, go together. In every act of creation, there often is an act of destruction as well, even if it's only clearing the space. Sometimes before we can, our creative energies start with, I need to clear a space for myself in some way. So there can be a kind of violence involved in creativity. But what happens, on the other hand, if you have someone like Korach who refuses to talk altogether? Refuses to talk, but wants to maintain a kind of solipsistic, right? A solipsistic reality, which is the only way he can feel that he exists. He can't risk himself by entering into that play that has to do with talking to another person. It's too risky. It's too risky for him. And so what we have is a form, perhaps, in Korach, we have a form of madness, a form of creativity gone wrong, that he has refused to go with his machloket into that fertile direction. And here I wanted to quote from an English writer, G.K. Chesterton, who's famous for his detective stories, but he was also something of a theologian. He was a frum Catholic. He was and he wrote a book called Orthodoxy, believe it or not, which is actually quite interesting for Orthodox people of all religions to read. And this is a sentence from the book that I excerpted. He talks about madness. He says, "The madman is not the man who has lost his reason. The madman is the man who has lost everything but his reason. And his mind moves," there was another sentence, "his mind moves in a perfect but narrow circle." If you've ever talked to a madman recently, a certain kind of madman anyway, they have a way of being totally logical. They talk you into a corner. For that, the mind has to move in a perfect but narrow circle. Kol ha'ida kulam kedoshim. Everything is harmonious, everything is coherent in his point of view. He's lost everything but his reason. What would be the other things that he doesn't have? Maybe a chisaron. Maybe a crack in the system. His system is so perfect that it can't afford to allow very much into it. I can't afford to open it up in any way. I can't afford to allow anything but reason. That's the madness of total reason. And that means I'm not prepared to allow anything uncanny. Anything that in a way I can't justify by the use of reason. What kind of a madness is that then? And I think then of Levinas. And Levinas, the French Jewish philosopher, who wrote philosophy and he wrote Jewish philosophy. And in the end, they amount to the same thing. What is his fundamental idea? I'm quite sure that he knew these sources, that in some form or another, this whole tradition that I've been opening up here was open to him. And so he talks about the face of the other. He says what ethics is all about, what God is all about, actually. What does it mean to meet God at Har Sinai, at Mount Sinai? What does it mean? What does revelation mean? Revelation is that teaching moment, he calls it teaching, in which I meet the face of the other. Let me read the something of the passage. The voice coming, here he's talking about the voice coming from another shore, somewhere outside my system altogether, outside the system of my selfhood, which teaches transcendence, which teaches that there is something beyond. There is something beyond each individual person, humanity as a whole. Right? So that what we call the religious epiphany, the epiphany at Mount Sinai, is really, for him, it's the encounter with any other human being. Any other human being who in his otherness makes a demand of me, of one kind or another, questions me and my being, my whole being, just by being. Right? Not necessarily by saying difficult things. Who enters into a kind of, it doesn't have to be a verbal dialogue, but it's a situation in which he appeals to me in some way, he makes a demand of me, and I don't look at him as being like myself. I strongly feel the otherness of the other. And one of the motives that moved Levinas in developing this philosophy had to do with the experience of Jews in the Shoah and the sense of being the other in intellectual Europe. Turning up at the doorsteps of people and asking for everything, asking for limitless help, and the way the doors were closed in their faces because it was too strange, it was too consuming, the fear of being consumed, the fear of a need, the need of the other, the demand of the other. It's a refusal of an ethical encounter. And in some sense, he wants to say, the meeting with any other not just in that extreme situation, is what needs to be examined. Right? It starts with every day. And the threat that in a way the other constitutes. Yeah. This is not the romantic view, for instance, of friendship and marriage. Right? This is the view that says it's a challenging situation. Friendship, marriage, being with an other person. It's not a matter of discovering how much we have in common. That we usually know before we get married. That's the romance of it. And far be it from me to put down romance, but I want to hear what Levinas is saying. He is saying that the other, even if it's the other that I live with all my life, and in a sense I love, the other can drive me crazy. Yeah. Because the other is in another shore. He is something, I want to quote from him again, because he says it better than anyone else, any paraphrase of him. He says, the other is that which escapes me entirely. It's almost an outrage. How can you say that? And the other is who I talk to. Oh, that's all I have to do, really. I have to enter into what's called dibur with the other. Once I'm in dibur, then in a sense, I owe the other person everything. Korach is right. I better keep away from it. Because the ethical demand of the other wants something of me. Always. Even if it's not obvious. And that can make me feel very far from my lights, from the lights of my being. And so what you have here is a sense, on the one hand, of an embattled state. The otherness is not easy to deal with. On the other hand, you have the idea, which emerges from Rabbi Nachman, that there could be a halal panui. There could be a positive creation of a fertile space between the two of you. Winnicott calls it a potential space. And the potential space is where language grows. That's where you can really begin now to develop some kind of shared language. There are elements of the one and there are elements of the other, but that takes a great deal of, what can I say, of willingness to expose oneself, of willingness in a way to make less of oneself, to present less of a demand in order to, it's an unequal relationship in that case, according for Levinas. The other is the one whose demands I have to listen to. I have no right to anything in this situation. Now that's carrying it very far. And there's been Levinas has come in for a lot of questioning on this issue. But it's very hard to best Levinas. Levinas really has a very deep sense of what he means by this. And I'd like to connect this then with the idea, again, something that Levinas himself says, and with this we'll move towards the last issues. So what does Levinas, what has he got to say that I want to connect with here? He talks about, yes, he says, in the confrontation with another, there is the trembling of the uterus. What a the trembling of the uterus. That is, he's taking on a feminine embodiment here. Right? The image now is feminine. What does the uterus do? The uterus, that is housing something that is other. The uterus of a woman. And he uses the word uterus rather than womb. That is something that is most inside you, the woman. It's most you, but it's an empty space. And it's an empty space that cries to be filled. And when it's filled, in some way, it's trembling with a strain. I'll use it in his language as well. He says, the other gestates within the same. Here I am, in a way, I would just like to be the same old person as I've always been. I'd like to carry on knowing what I think, and knowing exactly what I think, and the boundaries of my being, and so on. And suddenly, there is an other who's not just out there challenging me, but he's right here in the middle of me. He's here taking up that empty space, and that's called creation. That's creation at its most organic, at its most biological. Right? And what happens there, he says, the other gestates within the same and is forever bursting open, unable to contain the more that it contains. The less, I'm sorry, I missed that. The less, there's the less and the more. The less with a capital L, which is me, is forever exploding, forever bursting open, trying to contain, right? Like it's impossible to contain the thing that it does contain. Right. So he's talking about birth, but he's also talking about an ongoing sensation, that I've got a too muchness inside me, and I'm really too little, in a way. I can't contain it. It's not just out there, but it's actually in here. That is the rechem, and that is Rahmanut. And so, Rabbi Nachman will say, God created the world in order to exercise Rahmanut. There's a trembling uterus somewhere there. Somewhere there is a sense, what goes on in the uterus? And here I want to quote a psychoanalyst whose work just came to my attention, and I find it very difficult. So I'm not exactly recommending it, because it's not very comprehensible, it seems to me. But in any case, here it goes. The woman's name is Bracha Ettinger. She's Israeli, I think. And she has this very striking idea that I want to pick up now by way of bringing things to a close. And she talks about the matrix, that is, the womb, as creating a certain particular sense of self and other. What you have, what the mother and the baby have, is a certain relationship in which the other was mixed up with me. The other as other, I knew it was other to me, and it's right there inside me, at the heart of me. And then the other separates from me and is born out into the world. But then both baby and mother, both child and mother, have, right, they individuate, certainly the child individuates, that's the whole job of the child's life, and, to move away from the enveloping mother and to become an individual and to become separated and to have his own opinions and his own everything. But the child will never manage to get rid entirely of that ghost, of the memory of the womb. And the womb is an alternative state of being, it's Rahmanut, which is a feeling of being mixed up with the other. I can only use that expression, and there might be better expressions, but although officially one's job is to separate. To separate and to know the limits of my being, and to recognize that Moshe can be different from other people. All that, but at the same time, there is a strange compassion, she wants to say. She uses the word compassion, and she clearly means calm passion. Not pity. It's nothing like pity. It's a certain feeling with. Right? That is, that aside from all the things we say about individuality and individuating, there is also, in any child born of mother, or mother born, there is also Yelud Isha. That's the Jewish expression for mortal human being. Yelud Isha, born of woman. Anyone who is born of woman will know that there is another truth as well, which has to do with Rahmanut, which has to do with a kind of lessening of oneself and allowing oneself to be mixed up with the other. The most striking thing, she says then, is this, that mothers, of course, and then by extension fathers are also allowed to play the game of Rahmanut, Karachem of Albanim. The fathers are compassionate to their children. It means a certain strange sense of not that I am the father, the judge, the ruler, not that only, at least, but in some way, again, I'm mixed up with you, that you are part of me and I'm part of you. Where this becomes striking is where she claims that the child can develop Rahmanut, can access in himself, herself, Rahmanut for the parent. Now that's an interesting idea, I think. That although the child has great reason to fight his way to individuality, that's in a way his job, you might say, or some people say, there is at the same time, there is the possibility of a certain kind of grace, right? There's a certain kind of being together, which goes before and beyond words. Right? It's before words. Before the child could speak and have empathy for it's not empathy, exactly. Because empathy is understanding the situation of your parents. And that the child doesn't necessarily have. She'll go as far as to say that Yitzchak had compassion for Abraham as he was setting himself to sacrifice him. Now, either that will make sense to you or it won't. I can't really advocate for it because I feel that there's something very very real about that statement. The uncanny, not empathy, but compassion that a child can have for its parent. I've experienced it myself with my children, certainly, and I hope towards my parents, just on a personal level, but I think she's making a general statement here. She's not talking about one or two people. And it's that idea of Rahmanut that I want to finish with. Have a look at the Sfatimet. What do you have? What's the role of chesed in the world? Number 9. It's the last passage. He says, truly, Sfatimet is, we mentioned him before, Hasidic commentary on the Torah, and he's talking about Korach here. He says the whole world is based on chesed. The whole structure of the world has to be based on chesed. What is chesed? Well, that's not so easy. How is it translated on your page? Say again? Loving kindness. That's the classic translation. Okay, but chesed means much more than that. Chesed is the opposite of din. Yeah. Which means that it's not rational. In some way, it's all-consuming. It's illegal in some way. It violates boundaries. Chesed goes beyond boundaries, and then goes on to say here, it's when God created the world and He saw it's impossible that it should exist on the basis of din. Then He paired with din rachamim. That is, you have two principles now for creating the world. There has to be law, and there has to be this other thing that's called rachamim or chesed. Right, which is a kind of mixed up thing. It's not a rational category. Only in such a way can the world exist. And from this he draws a conclusion. He says this teaches you then that this world, the world that God created, eno b'shlemut. It's not a perfect world. It's not the world of wholeness, of shalom and shlemut. You want that, you have to go to another world. Olam haba, maybe, it could be that. In this world, it's a world in which there is a chisaron, there's a crack in the cup, and there's a rupture, which is part of the way the world is constituted. Everything you look at, if you look closely, you'll see there's a nick in it. Nothing has that wholeness that something in us desires. Let's call it a fantasy for the moment. But it's a fantasy because you don't find it in reality. There is, and something we devoutly wish for on some level. There's a yearning for that. And then there is a kind of stern need to come to terms with the fact that there's difference in the world. Right? And maybe there could be some kind of blessing in that. So Reb Leonard Cohen, had his way of putting it. What does he say? Ring the bells that still can ring. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. You think of a crack as a disaster. A crack in the earth, for instance, a terrible thing. But these were people who were defensive, says the Sfatimet, towards the end of the passage. These were people who were defensive and wouldn't allow there to be a crack in anything. They wanted to construe themselves as whole, as perfect. The terrible revenge that reality takes on such a person is that there is a real crack and they're destroyed by it. What we have to recognize, the teaching here is that this world has a crack in it. And when do you feel the crack? Most keenly. He puts it like this. What was created? Quoting. What was created? Erev Shabbat ben Hashmashot. Just at the end of the 6-day world, as God created it. The end of his creative process. He had just getting to the end. He's almost finished speaking. Right? He's almost finished speaking the world into being. Just at twilight then, what was created then? Certain things were created. 10 things. Thank you. 10 things. Among them, 3, I think, or 4 mouths. There's the mouth of the well, the mouth of the ass that talks, strange collection of things, and the mouth of the earth that opens up. Now, what do all these things have in common? And so the idea somewhere here would be that the fantasy of wholeness has this crack in it. if one recognizes the crack, then what happens just before Shabbat? Right, that's where I was. Just before Shabbat, God creates, among other things, the Mazikin, which are the destructive demons that come and tear everything apart. The forces of chaos. Aggressive, destructive forces are created right at the end, as if a kind of culmination of all the trouble there is in the world. All the things not going neatly and coherently in one direction. I always say a little mischievously that you can witness this in many Jewish houses just before candle lighting. 10 minutes before candle lighting, you can witness chaos. Right? Madness is come, chaos has come again. And I have these memories of when I had small children. When I had small children, and there really was that feeling of, nothing is in order. And lighting the candles, and suddenly the only thing one can do is reach out beyond the system of this world. I'm not going to find my redemption in the system. It's not complete. And so I reach beyond it to some kind of grace, you want to call it that. And you light the candles, and there is the grace. And sometimes, I was lucky, and I had one child particularly who felt my turmoil, that I was not the way I was supposed to be. That feeling, I feel disturbed at the fact that I'm disturbed. And he would put a reassuring hand into mine, as if to say, that's Rahmanut. That's the Rahmanut. He doesn't understand what I'm going through. He has no capacity for that. But he could feel something, and that is, in a way, there he is, expressing compassion in some way, saying, we're together. We're together here. Now, that moment of grace, right, is only achieved when you've given up, in a sense, on expecting order in this world. And so what happens then, he says, is then there is shalom, a brief taste of shalom, shlemut, which is Shabbat. Shabbat comes as a kind of gift. Doesn't really belong to this world. And then you roll back to the beginning of things. You start all over again, and then you go back to the world. And you go back to that creative, strenuous endeavor, which has in it forces of disorder. But hopefully, forces of disorder that can be kept within limits. Right? That somewhere there is a recognition of the way in which then you deal with the other. Allow a space in between, and allow for the possibility of constant movement. Right? You open yourself up. There's a feeling of possible growth, of becoming more than you were. And then again, the moment of grace. Now, clearly here, in this image of things, this picture of things, it's a dynamic picture, and it's a picture of the need for both sides. That one needs the din side, and one needs the chesed side. Right? One needs the turmoil, and one needs some visitation of peace. In this world, we don't go further than that. And what I find, let me finish with this, what I find particularly, I would say almost transformative about this idea that the chisaron is essential to us, it's not just a matter of modesty, it's not just a matter of humility. That I lower my profile somewhere. But it's a way of saying it's normal. It normalizes the rupture. And it says what we tend to sense as tragic actually is the way it is. That's just the way it is. And in a strange sense, that can give one nachat ruach. That is, there's some kind of a response here to our feeling. And don't be so melodramatic about it, in a way. That's the way it is. That's the way it is means that one can actually survive it. One can survive it if certain spaces are left, and certain welcome to the other is still possible. And of course, if Shabbat is also given, if there is the possibility of intervals of grace in which some other fantasy can find at least some expression, then we can go on with the struggle, which is the struggle of this world. Thank you. So next week is our last meeting, and we'll be looking at Parshat Chukat, Moshe speaking and not speaking to the rock. Yes? Okay.
Does this seem like a typo? Should I type it over that W?
Yes.